Okay, we've moved to the second week of instructional videos, and this one is entitled The Three Cultures, Three Ancient Cultures. Hello and welcome back to the instructional video series for the Agon Institute, which is brought to you by both CSRM and Uncharted Waters. I'm Dr. Greg Linville, and I serve as the professor for this Models of the 21st Century Sports Ministry course. And every one of our courses, as we've mentioned before, has a little bit of review and a little bit of preview. And we're a little bit into the review here today that comes out of our history course, our ancient history course, and this ancient history is helping us understand a basic concept that is prevalent throughout all the different eras and centuries and millennia, and that is that sport and faith have had a very strong intersection and a very strong affiliation with one another all through of the human existence. We've seen that in the last lessons of last week, how both the Greek and the Romans had a dominant perspective of sport in their culture, and how many of the people in that day and age was actually part of that culture. Today we're going to look at it in a more summary fashion, and we're going to compare it also to the Jewish perspective and set it up as a moving forward for our Christian era that came, and also then moving it out of the Christian era that came in the ancient days into the modern day with our various sports ministries today. And the basic concept that we've talked about a little bit in the previous instructional videos is the body, mind, and spirit that seem to permeate all of these cultures. Well, let's jump in here, and let's talk by brief review about the Greek and the Roman, and then we can add the Jewish as well. You have a chart, and you have PowerPoints that have been given you, hard copies that you're supposed to fill in. And we're going to go in each of these cultures, and we're going to look at them in terms of their civic and religious goal, their personal concerns, the virtues that they felt very important about to be communicated here, the rewards that came to athletes, who the games were for, and the athletes themselves. And so you see in this first column about the Greek that their civic or religious goal was freedom, to be free to express themselves, to be free in association. This was a very key concept for them. Their personal concern, in terms of the individual person, what was they concerned about in their life, was beauty. And that the focus was on the body. And you see a lot of these ancient Greek sculptures, and the physiques are so beautiful, and they're contoured, they're muscular, they're alive. This was very much part of the Greek culture, and the athletes performed naked, and so all to accentuate the body and the form of the body. Their virtue had to do with wisdom, and that's why that the athletes were trained in philosophy as well as in athletics. Their focus was on the mind, the body and the mind. Their rewards were internal meaning, what would I get? The feeling that I get, the sense of satisfaction and accomplishment. Because after all they were awarded were these crowns of vegetation. We talk about this more in our spiritual formation video series that accompanies this particular instructional video. But that's why we say it was internal. The Greek athletes would work for years and not receive any kind of external monetary reward, at least for winning the games. Sometimes people would provide them with jobs or other subsidies outside of the games, but the games themselves were strictly for the experience, and there was no monetary reward. The games were for the athletes. There were very little, if any, accommodations for any of the spectators that might come, and so the games were really for the athletes. And the athletes themselves were held in the highest esteem. If you could become a Greek athlete, particularly one who had won and was victorious, you were feted, so to speak, F-E-T-E-D, feted, meaning you were celebrated. And so for the Greek, it very much was a sense that these were the games were for the athletes, and it was to create a virtuous athlete, a well-rounded athlete. Now you add the second column to your list. They're the Romans. Their civic religious goal was a right, not freedom, but they had rights as Romans. And their personal concern was very much about power. The Roman Empire would dominate everybody. Their focus was on the government and ruling. The virtue, if you can call it a virtue, was on pleasure. The focus was on self. What am I getting? Particularly because the games, skipping down one, the games were not for the athletes but for the fans. And so the fans were saying, what am I getting out of this? What can I do to experience this more and have more fun watching these gladiators go after it? And the rewards for the athletes were external. They would get gold. They would get wins. If nothing else, in the Colosseum, they would save their life. And so there was an external reward, if you will. And the athletes were expendable. They were for the fans' enjoyment only. Let me go a little deeper on this with the Romans. The Romans were only after pleasure and thrill-seeking as a culture. They wanted all of these games then to be for the fans' enjoyment because the athletes were dispensable. Politicians would put on these games to elicit votes. Sound familiar? To keep people content because there was a lot of problems in the world then. Rome was very efficient, and when they overtook an inferior country or culture, they would force their superior ways upon the conquered. But if they overtook a superior culture in any way, shape, or form, they would allow those cultures to stand and become part of the Roman culture. Thus, the Greek games was incorporated into the Roman, but it was very much changed. They thought that the Greek athletics could be improved, and thus they turned them into what they wanted them to be, the decadent, brutal, gladiatorial games, not the high ideal games of the Greeks. And so the Western games, meaning Roman, became much more decadent. The Eastern maintained some sanity in retaining the true essence of competition, but the one crossover between them was the chariot races that they seemed to both enjoy. So we have this Roman perversion, we have this Greek high ideal, and then we have this sense of what happens when we compare this to the Jewish perspective. The Jewish civic or religious goal was righteousness. You've got to become righteous before God. Nakedness was a disgrace. That was a concern that they had. And their virtue was obedience. Their focus was on God, not on the people, not on themselves. And their rewards they were eternal, forever and ever. The games, they thought they should be for no one. And they viewed the athletes as frivolous. So the Jews primarily thought the whole athletic realm, at best, was frivolous and probably decadent, because it promoted self-glorification, opposed to the glory of God. It promoted the statues of victors, opposed to the abhorrence of evils and graven images. And it uncovered the human body and this was in opposition to modesty. So it is in this milieu then that one can understand the situation and the conundrum of Apostle Paul. He was a Roman citizen, and yet he was still the Jew, but he was raised in a Greek culture. He could clearly comprehend the problems of the Roman approach: obliteration of life, the deification of athletes and emperors, the sacrificing of Christians. It's very likely that Paul had to fight wild beasts when we look at the passage in Ephesus in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 32. He understood the martyrs, those who were a spectacle to the world. The word in the New Testament that he uses is theatron, those that are on display, where we get our theater today, our word for theater. He also knew the indulgences of the Greek in terms of nakedness and hero worship. But he had a first-hand knowledge of how athletics in and of themselves were not necessarily negative. And he desired to use them appropriately. Now we get into a lot more about the Apostle Paul in some of our spiritual formation videos and also in our history course, also some in our ethics course, but you can understand that Paul then, this is the culture and the era that he walked into. Now this is not to say that all of the Jews and the Jewish involvement in sport, that they never happened, because the games were pushed in 175 to 164 BC, before Christ, by Antiochus Epiphanes. They were very much pushed. And even the Jewish priest, it's recorded that they began to neglect their duties, doing the sacrifices, etc. And they hastened to the arenas to the great dismay of many faithful Jews. And of course, Herod the Great, having a Jewish background, built both amphitheaters and hippodromes. Amphitheaters were where a lot of the athletic games took place, and the hippodromes were where they did the chariot races. And he also held sports festivals every 4 years in honor of Caesar Augustus. So it's not like the Jews weren't involved, but the more secular that they became, the more they became involved. Now, let me put this in context for the 21st century. The 21st century, I would say that the Roman perspective is much more like, particularly the Western world views sport. Our football, American football, is in great danger today because of all the bodily wear and tear, the concussions, etc. And so I would compare a lot of our Western sports and maybe our worldwide sports to the Roman. The harsher, the bigger hits, the more disheveled a body can become, the better. I would compare some of what goes on in the amateur levels as more like the Greek ideals. And then I think that there's this whole idea of those that withdraw totally, like Jews did in that day, the faithful Jews. They totally rejected sport. And in one of our courses here, we also teach about the 4 responses to sport. Those that totally capitulate, the Romans; those that accommodate, more like the Greeks; those that reject, like the Jews; and those that try to go to redeem and do the redemption part of this. This is where I believe that the Christian needs to go. And we talk about this in our theology class, because it was created good, the fall came and it was made decadent, and we need to redeem and be redeemed. And that's what a Christian approach to sport needs to take. And so for you who are contemplating the models of 21st century sport ministry, that's where you need to fall into, that 4th quadrant of trying to redeem not only the people of sport, but the culture of sport. That'll come through more in our class, and as we talk more about this in the future. We're going to jump quite a few centuries next time. We're going to jump right into the muscular Christianity era that began in the early to mid 1800s, continuing to develop our concepts about models for sport. I'm Dr. Greg Linville for the Agon Institute. Thanks for joining us.